Normandy, France, June 1944. Sergeant Tommy Mitchell had survived Dunkirk, the North African desert, and the London Blitz. At 28, he was considered a veteran by the recruits in his unit. Nothing could prepare him for what he was about to hear. As his company cautiously advanced through a clearing near Caen, a sound cut through the morning air like a chainsaw cutting through wood, a mechanical, relentless roar that seemed to come from hell itself. In a split second, Mitchell and his men threw themselves to the muddy ground, hearts pounding, as the terrifying buzzsaw continued its deadly symphony. The sound was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was not the spaced-out bursts of British Bren guns or American bars, but a continuous, hypnotic roar that seemed to go on forever. The German MG-42 had just announced its presence. What Mitchell didn't know in that moment of terror was that he was experiencing the most psychologically devastating weapon of World War II, not because of its killing power, though that was formidable, but because of something far more insidious. The MG-42 had weaponized sound itself, turning audio into a force that could paralyze experienced soldiers before the first bullet found its mark. The mathematics of terror were simple. A British Bren gun fired roughly 500 rounds per minute. The American Browning automatic rifle managed about 650. Both weapons produced a distinctive rhythm that soldiers could count, predict, and mentally process. Rat-a-tat-tat. Pause. Rat-a-tat-tat. The human brain could parse these sounds, find patterns, calculate gaps for movement. The MG-42 fired 200 rounds per minute. At that rate of fire, individual shots blurred into a continuous mechanical scream. There was no rhythm to count, no pattern to exploit, no pause to anticipate. It was audio chaos that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primal fear centers of the brain. The weapon's development had begun in 1937, when German engineers at Grossfuss Metall and Lackierwaren Fabrik received a contract to create the ultimate machine gun. The specifications were revolutionary: achieve a rate of fire that would make individual shots indistinguishable, create a weapon that could break enemy morale through sound alone, and engineer a system that could sustain this psychological assault indefinitely. Dr. Werner Gruner, the lead engineer on the project, had studied the psychological effects of industrial machinery on factory workers. He discovered that certain frequencies and rhythms could induce panic responses in humans, even when no actual danger was present. The MG-42 was designed to exploit these psychological vulnerabilities systematically. The secret lay in the weapon's revolutionary roller-delayed blowback system. Unlike conventional machine guns that used gas pressure to cycle the action, the MG-42 employed a system of precisely machined rollers that controlled the bolt's movement with mechanical precision. This system eliminated the slight variations in timing that characterized other weapons, creating the unnaturally consistent rhythm that made the gun sound inhuman. Private Danny Walsh, 19 years old and fresh from basic training, pressed his face into the Norman mud beside Mitchell. His hands shook uncontrollably as the buzzsaw continued its deadly song, somewhere ahead in the tree line. Walsh had trained for months on recognizing enemy weapons by sound. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Walsh's training had included extensive audio recognition drills. Instructors had played recordings of German weapons, the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles, the measured chatter of MG-34 machine guns, the whistle of Nebelwerfer rockets. Each weapon had a signature sound that revealed tactical information about enemy positions and capabilities. The MG-42 defied this audio intelligence. Its sound provided no useful tactical information because it overwhelmed the auditory processing centers of the brain. Soldiers couldn't determine the weapon's exact location, estimate the crew size, or calculate ammunition expenditure rates. The buzzsaw created acoustic chaos that rendered traditional sound-based tactics useless. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In the acoustic confusion of the hedgerow country, the MG-42's roar bounced off stone walls and earthen banks, creating an echo chamber effect that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Was it one gun? 3? An entire machine gun company? The continuous fire suggested overwhelming numbers to soldiers trained to think in terms of burst patterns and ammunition conservation. This acoustic confusion was deliberately engineered into the weapon's tactical employment. German machine gun crews were trained to position their weapons in locations that would maximize sound distortion. Natural amphitheaters, stone buildings, and dense vegetation were all used to amplify and scatter the MG42's audio signature. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, the gunner operating the weapon that terrorized Mitchell's company, had spent 6 months at the Wehrmacht's machine gun school in Döberitz, learning these acoustic tactics. The curriculum included lessons on sound propagation, echo effects, and psychological warfare through audio manipulation. Müller understood that his weapon's true power lay not in its ballistic performance, but in its ability to create paralyzing fear through sound alone. He had positioned his MG42 in a slight depression that created a natural sound amplifier, making his single weapon sound like an entire machine gun platoon. Mitchell forced himself to think through the terror. His experience told him this had to be a single weapon, but his ears insisted otherwise. The sound was too continuous, too sustained for one gun. Yet somewhere in his rational mind, he knew the Germans were masters of psychological warfare. This had to be their latest innovation. The psychological impact was immediate and measurable. Captain James Morrison, commanding Mitchell's company, found his decision-making processes severely impaired by the continuous audio assault. Morrison had commanded men through brutal fighting in Italy, where he'd learned to process multiple sources of battlefield information simultaneously. The MG42 created what military psychologists would later term cognitive overload. The brain's auditory processing centers became so overwhelmed by the weapon's sound that other mental functions began to deteriorate. Officers found themselves unable to issue coherent orders. Radio operators couldn't distinguish voice communications from background noise, and soldiers lost the ability to coordinate tactical movements. Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, a German military psychologist who studied the MG42's effects, documented these cognitive impacts in classified reports. His research showed that exposure to the weapon's sound for more than 2 minutes could reduce combat effectiveness by up to 60%, even among experienced troops. The weapon's psychological ammunition was more sophisticated than simple noise. The MG42's sound contained specific frequency components that triggered primal fear responses in the human nervous system. The mechanical consistency of the rhythm activated the same neural pathways that responded to predator sounds in humanity's evolutionary past. What Mitchell couldn't know was the engineering marvel that created his nightmare. The MG42 represented a fundamental shift in machine gun philosophy. Where Allied weapons prioritized accuracy and ammunition conservation, the German weapon was designed around one principle: overwhelming firepower delivered at a rate that would break enemy morale before tactical considerations even mattered. The development process had required solving unprecedented engineering challenges. The weapon's rate of fire generated enormous heat, requiring the development of new steel alloys and cooling systems. The mechanical stresses involved in cycling 1-200 rounds per minute demanded precision manufacturing that pushed 1940s technology to its limits. The barrel design alone represented a breakthrough in metallurgy. German engineers developed a chrome-lined barrel that could withstand the extreme temperatures generated by sustained rapid fire. More importantly, they created a quick-change barrel system that allowed crews to swap overheated barrels in under 10 seconds, maintaining continuous fire indefinitely. The ammunition feeding system was equally revolutionary. Traditional machine guns used fabric belts or metal strips that often jammed under rapid fire conditions. The MG42 employed a new belt design with precisely engineered metal links that could feed smoothly at maximum rate of fire without binding or misfeeding. But the Germans had solved more than just mechanical problems. They had created a weapons system that turned logistics into lethality. The MG42 fed from 250-round belts that could be linked together for continuous fire. More importantly, it featured a quick-change barrel system that allowed crews to swap overheated barrels in seconds, maintaining sustained fire indefinitely as long as ammunition lasted. The weapon's crew training was as sophisticated as its engineering. German machine gunners underwent extensive psychological conditioning to operate effectively under the stress of sustained combat. They learned to function while creating the very audio chaos that paralyzed their enemies. Gefreiter Klaus Weber, Müller's assistant gunner, had completed this specialized training at the machine gun school in Döberitz. The curriculum included lessons on maintaining mental focus, while operating in extreme acoustic environments, techniques for coordinating with other crew members using hand signals when verbal communication became impossible, and methods for sustaining psychological pressure on enemy forces through calculated fire patterns. Weber's role was critical to the weapon's psychological impact. He fed ammunition belts into the MG42 with mechanical precision, ensuring that the terrifying buzzsaw never paused for reloading. His training had taught him to anticipate the gunner's needs, preparing fresh ammunition and spare barrels before they were required. The psychological warfare was working exactly as intended. Through his binoculars, Muller could see the Allied soldiers pressed flat against the ground, paralyzed by the sound of his weapon. Some were clearly experienced troops, men who should have been advancing under fire or attempting to flank his position. Instead, they lay motionless, overwhelmed by audio terror. This was the MG42's secret weapon. It didn't just kill soldiers, it broke their will to fight. The continuous roar created a psychological barrier that was often more effective than physical obstacles. Men who would charge through barbed wire and cross minefields found themselves unable to advance against the buzzsaw's mechanical scream. The weapon's design reflected German understanding of modern warfare's psychological dimensions. World War I had taught military theorists that morale was often more important than firepower. The side that broke first usually lost, regardless of tactical advantages. The MG42 was engineered to break enemy morale through sensory overload. German tactical doctrine emphasized the MG42's psychological impact as much as its ballistic performance. Machine gun crews were taught to fire long, sustained bursts designed to create maximum audio impact rather than short, accurate bursts aimed at specific targets. The goal was to terrorize entire enemy units, not just eliminate individual soldiers. This approach represented a fundamental shift in machine gun employment. Previous weapons were used primarily for area denial and suppressive fire. The MG42 was the first weapon designed specifically for psychological warfare through acoustic assault. The bullets were almost secondary to the sound, but the weapon's psychological impact came with significant costs. The MG42 consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. Muller's position contained over 3,000 rounds, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained fire. Each minute of psychological warfare cost the German army resources that were becoming increasingly scarce as the war progressed. The weapon also generated enormous heat, requiring barrel changes every few hundred rounds to prevent warping or catastrophic failure. The crew had to maintain multiple spare barrels, each weighing several pounds and requiring careful handling to prevent damage. The logistics of supporting an MG42 position were complex and resource-intensive. More critically, the MG42's effectiveness depended on surprise and initial shock. Once enemy forces adapted to the sound and developed counter-tactics, the weapon became more conventional in its impact. The key was maximizing that initial psychological advantage before the enemy could recover. The acoustic science behind the weapon's terror was sophisticated. German researchers had discovered that sounds above 1,000 cycles per second, delivered at sufficient volume and duration, could trigger involuntary stress responses in humans. The MG42's firing rate produced exactly these frequencies, creating a weapon that attacked the nervous system as much as the body. Dr. Ernst Kretschmer, a German neurologist who consulted on the MG42 project, had studied the effects of industrial noise on factory workers. His research showed that certain sound patterns could induce panic, disorientation, and cognitive impairment in healthy adults. The MG42 was designed to weaponize these findings. The weapon's sound contained multiple frequency components that affected different aspects of human psychology. The fundamental firing rhythm triggered fear responses, while harmonic frequencies created disorientation and confusion. The overall effect was a multi-layered assault on the human nervous system. Mitchell began to understand this as he forced himself to analyze the situation tactically. The gun had been firing for nearly 3 minutes without pause, which meant the crew was either supremely confident or desperately trying to maintain psychological pressure. Either way, they were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. Mitchell's analysis was based on hard-won experience with German tactics. He had learned to read battlefield situations by observing patterns in enemy behavior. Sustained fire usually indicated either abundant ammunition supplies or desperate circumstances. Given the tactical situation, desperation seemed more likely. The sergeant's combat experience had taught him that psychological weapons were often more fragile than conventional arms. Once soldiers understood the source of their fear and developed coping mechanisms, psychological warfare lost much of its effectiveness. The key was breaking through the initial terror to reach rational analysis. "Listen," Mitchell told his squad leaders. "That gun's been firing continuously. They're either running low on ammo or they're about to change barrels. Either way, there'll be a pause. When it stops, we move." The plan was simple, but required overcoming the psychological barrier the MG-42 had created. Mitchell's men would have to advance toward the source of their terror, trusting that the mechanical monster could be defeated by conventional infantry tactics. Corporal Eddie Kowalski, the Detroit factory worker who had first recognized the weapon's mechanical nature, became crucial to implementing Mitchell's plan. Kowalski's industrial experience had taught him to distinguish between different types of mechanical sounds, identifying maintenance requirements and operational limitations by audio cues alone. "Sarge, that barrel's getting hot," Kowalski whispered. "Listen to how the sound's changing. The pitch is getting higher and there's a slight vibration that wasn't there before. They'll have to change it soon or risk a catastrophic failure." Kowalski's analysis proved accurate. The MG-42's continuous fire was pushing the weapon beyond its design limits. The barrel temperature was approaching critical levels, and the crew would soon be forced to pause for maintenance or risk destroying their weapon. The opportunity came sooner than expected. After 4 minutes of continuous fire, the buzzsaw suddenly stopped. The silence was almost as shocking as the initial burst had been. For a moment, nobody moved, wondering if this was a trap or if the weapon had finally exhausted its ammunition. The sudden silence created its own psychological impact. Soldiers who had become accustomed to the continuous roar found the quiet almost unbearable. The absence of sound was as disorienting as its presence had been, creating a moment of vulnerability that experienced troops could exploit. Mitchell made the decision that would define his war. "Now, move!" The squad erupted from their positions, advancing in short rushes toward the German position. The psychological spell was broken, replaced by trained tactical movement and aggressive action. They had learned the MG-42's first lesson. The sound was terrifying, but it was still just a machine operated by men. The advance revealed the sophistication of the German position. Müller and Weber had prepared their fighting position with meticulous attention to both ballistic and acoustic considerations. The gun was positioned to maximize fields of fire while creating optimal sound amplification effects. The position included multiple prepared firing points, allowing the crew to relocate quickly if their primary position was compromised. Ammunition was pre-positioned at each location, along with spare barrels and maintenance equipment. The Germans had planned for sustained psychological warfare, not just brief tactical engagements, but Müller and Weber weren't finished. As the Allied soldiers advanced, Weber completed the barrel change with practiced efficiency. The fresh barrel was already heated and ready, the ammunition belt positioned for immediate feeding. Within 15 seconds, the MG-42 roared back to life. The effect on the advancing Allies was immediate and devastating. Men who had been moving with purpose and determination threw themselves back to the ground as the mechanical scream resumed. The psychological impact was even worse the second time, because they had briefly believed they had overcome their fear. This was the MG-42's most insidious characteristic. It could break morale repeatedly. Each time soldiers thought they had adapted to the sound, a fresh burst would send them back into psychological paralysis. The weapon trained men to fear their own courage, to doubt their ability to advance under fire. The renewed terror was more intense because it carried the weight of dashed hope. The brief silence had allowed soldiers to believe they could overcome their fear, making the weapon's return even more psychologically devastating. Some men began to question their own sanity, wondering if they would ever be able to function normally under fire again. Private Walsh found himself sobbing into the mud as the buzzsaw resumed its deadly song. The brief moment of hope during the silence made the renewed terror almost unbearable. He had thought they were winning, that they could overcome the mechanical monster. Now he felt more helpless than ever. Walsh's breakdown was typical of the MG-42's psychological impact on young soldiers. The weapon attacked not just immediate courage, but long-term confidence in one's ability to function under stress. Many soldiers who encountered the MG-42 reported persistent anxiety about their combat effectiveness, even in situations involving conventional weapons. The psychological damage extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. Military psychiatrists later documented a specific syndrome associated with MG-42 encounters: persistent auditory hallucinations, exaggerated startle responses to mechanical sounds, and chronic anxiety about personal courage under fire. Mitchell realized they were facing more than just a weapon. They were confronting a new form of warfare that attacked the mind as much as the body. The Germans had created a machine that could break experienced soldiers without firing a single effective shot. The psychological ammunition was more devastating than the physical bullets. The realization forced Mitchell to reconsider everything he thought he knew about infantry combat. Traditional tactics assumed that soldiers could function rationally under fire, making calculated decisions about movement, cover, and target engagement. The MG-42 eliminated rational thought, reducing experienced troops to primal fear responses. This represented a fundamental challenge to Allied military doctrine. Training programs had prepared soldiers for physical dangers: bullets, shells, and explosions. Nobody had prepared them for weapons that attacked their psychological foundations, that made them doubt their own courage and competence. The solution came from an unexpected source: artillery. Captain Morrison, recognizing that conventional infantry tactics were failing against the psychological weapon, called for indirect fire support. Within minutes, 105mm shells began falling around the German position. Morrison's decision represented innovative tactical thinking under extreme pressure. Traditional doctrine called for infantry to suppress machine gun positions with direct fire, then assault with grenades and small arms. The MG-42's psychological impact made this approach impossible, requiring adaptation of established tactics. The artillery had an effect that surprised everyone. It masked the sound of the MG-42. The explosions created enough acoustic chaos that the machine gun's psychological impact was diluted. Soldiers could no longer distinguish the buzzsaw's roar from the general cacophony of battle. This acoustic masking effect became a crucial discovery for Allied forces. Artillery and mortar fire could neutralize the MG-42's psychological impact, even when it couldn't destroy the weapon physically. The principle was simple: if soldiers couldn't hear the terrifying sound clearly, they could function more normally under fire. The discovery led to changes in Allied artillery doctrine. Forward observers were trained to recognize MG-42 positions not just by their tactical significance, but by their psychological impact on friendly forces. Artillery support was prioritized for situations where the weapon's sound was creating tactical paralysis. Under cover of the artillery barrage, Mitchell's men advanced successfully. They found Muller and Weber's position abandoned, the crew having withdrawn when indirect fire made their location untenable. The MG-42 itself lay abandoned, its barrel still hot from continuous firing. The abandoned position revealed the sophistication of German psychological warfare tactics. The crew had prepared multiple withdrawal routes, cached ammunition at alternate positions, and established communication with supporting units. The MG-42 was part of a comprehensive system designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing crew risk. Mitchell examined the weapon that had terrorized his men. Up close, it looked almost mundane: steel, wood, and mechanical precision. Nothing about its appearance suggested the psychological power it wielded. The terror had been in the sound, not the machine itself. The weapon's physical examination revealed the engineering sophistication that created its psychological impact. The barrel was precision machined to tolerances that pushed 1940s manufacturing capabilities. The action components showed wear patterns consistent with sustained high-rate fire, but the weapon remained functional despite extreme use. Most importantly, Mitchell could see the deliberate design choices that maximized acoustic impact. The muzzle brake was shaped to direct sound waves in specific directions, amplifying the weapon's audio signature. The barrel length and chamber dimensions were optimized for sound production as much as ballistic performance. But the lesson was learned. The MG-42 had introduced a new element to infantry combat: weaponized sound. The Germans had discovered that the right audio frequency, delivered at sufficient intensity and duration, could paralyze trained soldiers more effectively than physical barriers. The implications extended far beyond individual engagements. Allied forces began developing new tactics specifically designed to counter the MG-42's psychological impact. Training programs incorporated sound recognition and desensitization techniques. Artillery procedures were modified to provide acoustic masking for infantry advances. More importantly, the Allies began to understand that modern warfare involved psychological dimensions that traditional military doctrine hadn't addressed. The enemy wasn't just trying to kill your soldiers. They were trying to break their will to fight. The MG-42 was proof that this approach could be devastatingly effective. The weapon's impact on individual soldiers was profound and lasting. Veterans who encountered the MG-42 reported that the sound haunted them for decades after the war. The mechanical roar became associated with helplessness and terror in ways that conventional weapons fire never achieved. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McNamara, who later became Secretary of Defense, encountered MG-42 positions during the advance through France. In classified post-war interviews, he described the weapon's psychological impact as more significant than its tactical effectiveness. The MG-42 didn't just suppress our advance, it made our soldiers question their own courage. That's a more dangerous effect than any number of casualties. Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychiatrist who studied World War II veterans in the 1970s, found that MG-42 encounters produced a specific type of combat trauma. Unlike other battlefield experiences that soldiers could rationalize and process, the buzzsaw created memories of pure, irrational terror that resisted conventional therapy approaches. The MG-42 attacked something fundamental about human psychology, Dr. Chen noted in her research. It created a fear response that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at primal survival instincts. Soldiers couldn't think their way through the terror because the weapon was designed to prevent rational thought. Dr. Chen's research revealed the long-term psychological consequences of acoustic warfare. Veterans who had encountered MG-42 positions showed elevated stress responses to mechanical sounds decades after the war. Factory machinery, construction equipment, and even household appliances could trigger anxiety attacks in men who had otherwise recovered from their combat experiences. The medical implications were significant. Traditional combat stress was understood as a response to life-threatening situations. The MG-42 created stress responses that persisted long after the actual danger had passed, suggesting that acoustic warfare could cause permanent changes to the nervous system. The German military had stumbled onto something profound. Sound could be weaponized more effectively than many conventional arms. The MG-42's psychological impact often exceeded its actual lethality, creating tactical advantages that persisted long after individual engagements ended. This understanding influenced post-war military development in unexpected ways. Modern weapons designers began considering acoustic signatures as deliberately as they considered ballistic performance. The goal wasn't just to create effective weapons, but to create weapons that sounded effective enough to demoralize enemies before combat began. The Soviet Union developed acoustic weapons based on MG-42 principles during the Cold War. The AK-47's distinctive sound was partially designed to create psychological impact, though not to the extreme degree of the German weapon. American weapons designers incorporated similar principles into the M60 machine gun and later weapons systems. The MG-42's legacy extended into contemporary military doctrine. Special operations forces began using sound as a psychological weapon, employing audio systems that could disorient and demoralize enemies without physical violence. The principle remained the same: attack the mind to defeat the body. Modern psychological operations incorporate lessons learned from MG-42 encounters. Military psychologists understand that acoustic warfare can be more effective than conventional weapons in specific tactical situations. The key is understanding how sound affects human psychology under stress. But perhaps the most important lesson of the MG-42 was about human adaptability. Despite its initial psychological impact, Allied forces eventually developed effective counter-tactics. Soldiers learned to recognize and overcome their fear responses. The weapon that seemed invincible through terror was ultimately defeated by human resilience and tactical innovation. The adaptation process revealed important truths about combat psychology. Fear responses could be managed through training and experience. Soldiers who understood the source of their terror could develop coping mechanisms that allowed them to function effectively despite psychological pressure. Mitchell's encounter with the MG-42 became a defining moment in his military service. He had faced his deepest fear and discovered that courage wasn't the absence of terror, but the ability to function despite it. The buzzsaw had taught him that psychological warfare could be more devastating than physical violence, but also that the human spirit could adapt and overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at demoralization. The lessons learned from MG-42 encounters influenced post-war military training. Soldiers were taught to recognize and manage fear responses, to understand that psychological pressure was a legitimate weapon that could be countered through proper preparation and mental conditioning. The weapon's influence extended beyond military applications. Industrial psychologists studied the MG-42's acoustic effects to understand how sound affected worker productivity and safety. The research led to improved workplace noise control and better understanding of acoustic stress in civilian environments. The German MG-42 represented a watershed moment in military history, the first weapon deliberately designed to exploit human psychology as much as human physiology. Its mechanical roar announced not just the presence of enemy firepower, but the arrival of warfare that targeted the mind as systematically as traditional weapons targeted the body. The weapon's development marked the beginning of systematic psychological warfare through acoustic means. Military researchers began to understand that the human nervous system could be attacked as directly as physical targets, opening new dimensions of conflict that extended far beyond traditional battlefield considerations. In the end, the MG-42's most lasting impact wasn't on casualty statistics or tactical outcomes, but on military understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. The weapon that terrorized Allied soldiers with its buzzsaw roar ultimately taught them that fear itself could be defeated, that even the most sophisticated psychological warfare could be overcome by training, adaptation, and human courage. The sound that had paralyzed experienced soldiers in Norman hedgerows became a lesson in the power of both terror and resilience, proving that while machines could be engineered to exploit human weakness, humans could also engineer themselves to overcome their deepest fears. The MG-42's legacy lived on not in its mechanical innovations, but in its demonstration that the most powerful weapons are often those that attack the mind rather than the body. If you found this deep dive into the terrifying psychology of the MG-42 as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest historical investigations. We're constantly uncovering the untold stories behind the weapons, tactics, and moments that shaped our world.